Richard Chase, who has 6 lives on his account, cannot be attributed to the number of prolific maniacs, but one can safely be called one of the most cruel and terrible criminals in history. USA. In January 1978, residents of sunny Sacramento became aware that a serial killer was operating in the suburbs, devouring internal organs and drinking blood. The police came to the conclusion that the maniac had no logic in choosing victims. These were absolutely chaotic attacks, unrelated in any way. Richard Chase was a strange boy. Even as a child, sadistic tendencies began to actively manifest themselves. The Vampire from Sacramento was the nickname given to him by the media, and he considered himself a real vampire. It is still not clear how they appear among their own kind. Since childhood they seem to be quite healthy people. Defendant, what can you say about the reasons that pushed you to commit 6 heinous murders? The judge asked sternly, turning to a puny and some kind of pathetic. A person. It's simple, Your Honor. He shrugged his shoulders. I was driven to murder by UFOs acting on the orders of the Nazis, who, in turn, took revenge on me for being a Jew who stuffed a Star of David on his forehead. Seeing the judge's confusion, 28-year-old maniac Richard Trenton Chase hastened to add, "It's not difficult to make sure that I really took people's lives on the orders of UFOs. Let the FBI place radars on my body that can pick up signals from starships, and everything will fall into place." Nonsense. Nonsense. Absolutely, that's right. But much more nonsense is that the police did not stop the madman nicknamed the Vampire from Sacramento at the moment when the maniac committed the first crime. The maniac Richard Chase, born into a family of Americans of Anglo-Saxon origin, Protestants, was not a Jew and had no tattoos on his body. But whether the maniac kept in touch with UFOs was known only to him, a drug addict who had been addicted to marijuana since the age of 9 and had already switched to more severe ones at 16. Drugs. The impressive experience of receiving a variety of dope in the end affected. A rich mother, who endured that her son, in search of more and more intoxicating drugs, eviscerates neighbors' cats and rabbits, and then drives the blood of these animals into her vein, could no longer bear the complaints of her own child about impotence. And she brought the loafer, who lived at his parents' expense, to the best psychiatrist in Sacramento. The one who talked to Richard didn't say anything comforting. On the contrary, he told his mother, "Your son has a real paranoid schizophrenia, and his impotence is not predetermined by psychological factors. The causes, most likely the consequences of poisoning the body with toxic substances." Well, for whom, a schizophrenic, and for whom, a beloved child? Mrs. Chase, who has always believed that her child has some unknown, cosmic purpose, after learning that he turns out to be terminally ill, she only began to allocate even more to Richard for pocket expenses. However, everything in the world, including maternal love, comes to an end. For several years, the parent put up with the fact that she constantly has to pay fines to her neighbors for their pets, who were deprived of her life. Son. And I didn't even really get into Richard for the fact that the whole nursery of this 26-year-old monster was filled with cans and bottles filled with the entrails and blood of poor animals. However, one June night interrupted this idyll. About 2 o'clock in the morning, Mrs. Chase woke up from a sharp pain in her chest and, screaming and pushing away the stranger bending over her, turned on the night light. The sight presented to the woman in the dim light of the lamp could make anyone faint. The entire right half of her shirt was soaked in blood, and her son was standing by the bed, calmly chewing mother's meat. Seeing the horror on the face of the parent, the maniac spat, smeared blood on his lips and joyfully declared, "I am a vampire, Mommy." Soon, an ambulance was already rushing to the mother of the vampire, and he himself, through the efforts of his parent, ended up in a mental hospital the very next day. Because the psychiatric clinic in which Chase was placed turned out to be private, and the patient's treatment ended as soon as his rich mother died, who never recovered from the shock she experienced. A year later, the maniac Richard Trenton was released and for some time inspired fear in the neighborhood, chasing stray animals and running naked through the streets, smearing at the same time on the face of the newly drunk blood of mongrels. What to do with a completely crazy psychopath, whose mother still left him some inheritance, no one seemed to know. The maniac became a kind of landmark of the city and enjoyed such favor with some fellow countrymen that when this boy suddenly decided to buy a rifle, then it was sold to him against all the laws. Having got his hands on a weapon, Richard realized that not only animals, which he was used to dealing with his hands and a knife, could become his prey. And opened the hunting season for people. On the very eve of the new year, on December 29th, the executioner opened a human account. He shot.
Hey, I'm not going to beat around the bush. You have to subscribe to the channel and like it so you don't miss new videos.
51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, who was messing around with a car near the house. While the household of this father of 2 children, tearfully, they looked at the body and later rushed into the house to call the police, the maniac crept up to the victim, pumped the blood from the cooling body into a previously stored vessel and left. A couple of weeks later, while the police were lost in guesses, as if they didn't know who was in their area of responsibility already, famous for vampirism, Richard sneaked into the house of 22-year-old Teresa Vallin. By the time her husband David returned home, the fate of a young woman who was 3 months pregnant had been decided. The maniac not only decided to use it for sexual purposes, not only finished off the victim with a shot to the head, but also pumped blood from her body. I note that nothing like this has ever happened in the history of Sacramento. I would like to emphasize that the houses of both victims were less than a kilometer from each other. Let me remind you, the police were aware of the inclinations of the only one in the whole district. A bloodsucker. And yet, instead of having a good conversation with Richard, who lived in a city dump in those days, the police began to look for a guest performer. As if not believing that their countryman is capable of such atrocities. While the police were making a psychological portrait of the stranger, the fanatic was preparing for a new operation. On January 27th, a maniac armed with a rifle and a knife walked a couple of blocks from his rookery and invaded the house of 38-year-old Evelyn Myritt. What happened here went down in many Western textbooks of criminology as one of the bloodiest serial slaughterhouses in history, USA. First, Chase coldly took the life of Evelyn's 51-year-old roommate Dan Meredith with a rifle. And in front of the woman, her 6-year-old son Jason and 2-year-old nephew David Ferreira, he began, purring, to open the veins on Dan's body and drink blood from them. Then it was the turn of Evelyn, Jason, and David. The forensic experts who worked at the scene of the tragedy were amazed at what the sadist had done to the victims. Besides that Chase had abused both Mrs. Myritt and her nephew and her son. In addition to taking the bodies of the unfortunate ones with him, the experts were struck by the method of killing the victims, numerous shots into the anus of each of them. And finally, the police got lucky. A 6-year-old neighbor girl managed to get a good look at the man who entered Evelyn's house shortly before the tragedy. A child, even if he did not guess to call the police, however, did everything to help the police at the first screams and shots that came from the neighboring house. After the baby participated in the compilation of the sketch of the bad uncle, law enforcement officers, looking at his portrait, only grabbed their heads. It can't be. After all, it's old, good Richard Chase. Well, yes, the one who once snatched a part from his own mother. And only after that an impressive delegation of police officers showed up at the dump chosen by Chase. Richard, who did not think to hide, was caught here. The vampire was just sipping a drink from his favorite jug. A drink that, when taken for examination, turned out to be little Jason's blood. In the history of the United States, it seems, there was no second such criminal against whom the court decision would be changed over and over again. Execute. To consider abnormal, to treat. And again, execute. As a result, the fanatic was sentenced to death in the gas, a suspended execution cell. However, Chase did not wait for official retribution. The maniac voluntarily rid the world of himself. Relieved, as it turned out later, very unusually, complaining to the prison doctor about insomnia, the vampire from Sacramento, constantly, he demanded sleeping pills. Until he accumulated enough of it in his cell to go to hell. On December 28, 1980, Chase is found dead in his cell. Yes, this American killer has 6 people on his account, but the way he took their lives forced society to put him on the list of the most terrible serial killers of America in history. In 1987, the film Frenzy was made based on Chase's crimes.